everyone. Welcome back to our second episode with Professor Jared Shaw, talking about what you do after you've actually applied to grad school and gotten in. I feel like a good starting point is, I think in the last episode, Jared talked a little bit about, hopefully by the end of this cycle, you have a few choices ahead of you, and maybe not a lot, but anywhere between 2 to 5 choices. I think you said approximately half of the schools, or you should probably have gotten some kind of acceptance for. And at that point, it comes down to how to pick the program. So I guess we should start there. I think program versus PI is a good place to start. Like, how much do you focus on the program and how much do you focus on the research advisor at this stage of your selection process?
I think definition of the program for me is the number of PIs that you might actually want to work for. This group of folks that you might want to, join their lab and get a PhD. It'll come up multiple times, I'm sure, in this podcast, but the single most consequential choice you're going to make in graduate school is your choice of PI. And it sort of starts at the grad school selection level once you've been admitted. So I wouldn't worry about the program, meaning like the classes you take or other things. That will contribute, like I said earlier, to the vibe, right? When you visit a school, you might get this really great impression on like how well the students feel supported, how much they enjoy their classes. If they're all saying, man, there are 5 classes you take your first year and they're all really well integrated and the professors, coordinate so the material flows well. And at the end of that year, you really feel like you've learned a lot of chemistry in the area that you're going to study. That can sort of factor into which program you should accept. But that, again, comes down to what you perceive at the visit. So I would just say that the day you get admitted to various schools, go back and look carefully at the PIs that are there. And you will have the opportunity to visit that school. Make sure you get to visit with as many of those PIs as possible. And when you're signing up to visit PIs, you might then find out certain things that you weren't anticipating. Professor X is actually just about to leave for another school, or Professor Y is retiring. And so that can have a dramatic impact. You might have gotten into 3 schools. You might idly be thinking, one of those is your top choice. You then go to sign up for the visit and you find out, certain things about the school weren't quite what you thought. Doesn't mean you were lied to or, deceived. It just means that, these are all operations with humans and there are changes that happen. So I would say that, to get back to your question, the program, can be defined a couple different ways. The program as a collection of PIs you might want to work for is a very important choice. The program as a group of classes you might take, as an administrative entity that involves other things, those aren't necessarily going to have a huge impact on your day-to-day experience as a graduate student. So that's kind of what I would say. Is it comes down mostly to PIs.
So if you had the choice between, let's say, a program that had one person, or fewer professors that you can imagine yourself working for, and a program that had an abundance of professors you can imagine yourself working for, which one of these is the superior program to you? The one that maybe you're really passionate about one professor, incredibly passionate about one professor, or the one that, maybe you're not enthusiastic or as enthusiastic about any of these professors, but they would all be conducive to you getting a PhD in something that you wanted to get a PhD in. What, if you had to pick between those two options, what would be the stronger choice?
That is going to be something you might have to decide after visiting. The school with the one PI that you're really interested in, that might be the place for you. That might be the best possible PI for you to work for and the best possible experience. But if you're one of 8 students joining the program that year and they all want to work for that PI, there are going to be several people who have to make other plans. So in that situation, you would want a place with a better fallback plan. Even if your top choice of PI you were a little less enthusiastic about than the person at this other school, if you don't get that top choice, you have a better fallback plan. So you just have to weigh these things.
It seems like one is more risky. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you visit that first school and you find out that you're one of not very many organic students that were admitted, and that PI is very excited, says, hey, I was on the admissions committee. I read your application. I really think you're a fantastic student and I would love for you to come here and there's a very good chance you'd get into my group in the fall. That's not a guarantee, but that gives you some reassurance. If you get there and as part of the visiting crew, you're one of 8 people and every person you talk to is like, yeah, I really want to work for this person. It can give you a sense that this is going to be it's going to be competitive. And if it doesn't work out, I don't have a good fallback position. So those are just things you have to weigh. I would generally lean toward the program with more PIs than you want to work for, if I had to pick one of those 2 scenarios. But you might come to a different conclusion after visiting.
I have a question about kind of directly following applications. Generally, what is the range of dates that students actually get accepted?
That's an excellent question. It's gotten it's moved earlier and earlier every year as programs want to compete for students. And so, if all your application materials are in December 1st and the committee gets the people who are on the admissions committee to do all the reviewing, Christmas time, they might already have made a few decisions for certain candidates, and they want to get to those candidates early just to really communicate that enthusiasm and say, like, you're one of our top picks. We really want you to come to our program. We wanted to tell you as soon as possible. So you might start hearing in December that you've gotten into some schools at the earliest. Generally, it's going to be January. And also, admissions sometimes are spread out over a period of time. There's the first crew of students that you admit are the ones maybe that you are most enthusiastic about. You then admit a few more with a little more deliberation. And you can continue admitting students for quite some time if you felt like you wanted to. You might even have a late application, right? If someone says, oh man, I missed all the deadlines, can I still turn in my application for January 15th? Most programs will say, sure, you can turn in an application and we'll review it. A lot will say that. So you shouldn't take that as an invitation to like blow off deadlines, because absolutely many programs will say, sorry, apply next year. But we occasionally have students who apply late and they're good candidates. We want to admit them. So admissions can be a slow moving process over a couple of months. This is probably a good time to tell everyone that, the acceptance deadline is April 15th. So, and this is one thing grad schools have gotten together to do that's organized, that's useful, is everyone has to decide by April 15th, and no school can pressure you to accept before then. So a school can't come to you and say, hey, listen, if you want to come to our school, you have to tell us by February 1st. That would be tempting, because then you could sort of admit more people. It's like having, if you can only have 100 guests at your wedding and you have 150 friends, as you get those no's, you kind of want to pursue more people so you have a full wedding, right? I know that's very rude and obnoxious, and you're not supposed to do that, but it's the way things work.
It's a good analogy. Yeah, it's a really good analogy.
I definitely add more people at the end as I got more no's.
Have a wait list. It's always good to have a wait list.
I think everyone does, Nina. I think you're forgiven.
Thank you. Wait, speaking of visitation, I'm so curious from a professor's perspective. What's visitation like for you? Or what, just tell us about visitation.
Yeah, visitation's an interesting phenomenon. I tell students in my group that are getting into graduate school and going several pieces of advice. One, I tell all of them, this is a pro tip in my opinion. You should be able to walk up to a dry erase board or a chalkboard and talk about your research freehand for 10 minutes without looking at your phone or asking to pull up slides on your laptop. If you can do that, it is a really great way to be able to talk about your experience, and it demonstrates a lot. We're asking ourselves, can this person think on their feet? And right at that moment, assuming you can give a little chat about your research and answer a few questions, you've hit that bar. So I would say before you go on your visit, have that ready. The visits themselves often involve one-on-one meetings with PIs, and sometimes these are grouped now. So I usually have grouped meetings. I'll meet with 4 or 5 grad students at a time. It'll be a half hour or 40-minute meeting. I'll go around the room, just a little icebreaker. Where are you from and what kind of research have you done previously? Just like one sentence. I say one sentence, and sometimes I have to cut people off after 5 minutes, but that's another issue.
Oh, no.
And then I normally have like a little slide deck I'll go through that just sort of gives an overview of the group, not a whole lot of detailed science. and then I'll answer questions. And students have definitely gotten more assertive at asking questions at the stage. They'll ask, what is your mentorship style? Or, what level of support can you offer your students? Do students in your group have to TA a lot? I'll get these questions in that visit, which previously that would have been kind of not an affront, but it would have been like a little bit of a probing question to ask in that setting back when I was visiting. So I would say that this is a positive change. You can ask these questions, see how the PI answers. So that visit, though, is, again, it's like 40 minutes spread out over, it might be a one-on-one meeting, it might be with 4 students. It's not a whole lot of interaction. There's often a lunch or a dinner that professors get invited to with all the students around. There's often a poster session. Sometimes professors are at that poster session, sometimes not. And I tell my students that are presenting posters, the students currently in my group, I'll ask them later, what did you talk to? Which grad students did you talk to? Which visiting students did you talk to? And what were your impressions? I also tell students when they go to these campus visits, I tell them it's not an interview. You've already been accepted to the program. But it is absolutely 100% an interview for a group. You are being interviewed the entire time. The students are checking you out, asking themselves, do I want to work next to this person? Do I want to share a hood with them? Do I want to be in the group with them for 4 years? And PIs are often asking students, what were your impressions? So I would just say that, it's a fun time to hang out. You're there with a bunch of your peers. You're relaxed. It's not like it's not an interview. It's not high pressure. Some of these people you might have seen at the previous visit the weekend before. So there's a lot of that happens periodically. There's often alcohol involved. This is backed off a bit, but it used to be there'd be a poster session with, beer and snacks, and then dinner would maybe have alcohol, and there might even be a grad student who takes you out for drinks afterwards. I would say that's a lot of that has backed off for a variety of reasons. Alcohol rules have gotten more strict at schools. There's liability. When I was visiting schools, these visits were awash in alcohol. One in particular, I'm not going to say the school, but there was lots of drinking, capped off with a night at a bar. It was St. Patrick's Day, by the way. That happened to be the day when we were visiting. And there were platters of shots going around. And there were 2 of us who had to carry a visitor back to the hotel. He couldn't use his feet.
Oh, no!
I mean, I had never seen anyone this drunk in my life, and we called the hospital. We're like, do we do anything?
Oh my God.
That's just an aside. So I would say very little of that happens anymore, and which I think is for the best. The visit should be fun. A student should come and generally enjoy themselves. And it should be a time, though, to get to know students. And so the party aspect to it has like backed off, and which I think is for the best.
I agree. I mean, I want to echo and reiterate that, like, once you hit the visitation stage, even though you're in the program, you still need to uphold you have to kind of be a little bit on guard. And I feel like it's a little jarring because a lot of visitation programs still do the whole social aspect of the visitation. And that's nice. It's good to get a feeling for kind of what the social setting is like and what kind of people are in the program already, because that helps you figure out, am I going to fit in here from a social perspective, which is important. But Nina and I have also experienced students at visitation week, like when we were at Davis, like visiting and maybe going a little too hard on the partying side of things. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but don't, definitely have a good time.
Don't do that. Yeah.
But it's not the time to be messy, right? Like, it's not the time to be messy because you got in and you want to celebrate. But students talk, we will remember this. We don't have anything else really going on in life in grad school. So this is an event that most likely
visitation
we will remember.
Is a huge event for us.
Yeah. I mean, because it's for the graduate students, it's nice because if you're already in a lab, it's a nice excuse to hang out with other people in lab, and it can be a fun social gathering. But if you're just visiting, that's really not the vibe. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up is speaking of people, you might have seen them at or interacted with people at other visitation weeks, and you might remember who these students are while you're going through your schools. Nina and I, we went to different schools for our postdocs, and we talked about students that visited our respective postdoc schools, and there was overlap. So there was a student who was visiting at my postdoc institution that also, I think like 2 weeks later, ended up visiting Nina's postdoc institution. And then there's possibility of trading notes that way, because now we have like different, Nina and I were like, oh, who is this student? This student's interested in her lab and also interested in the lab that at Yale. And then we can figure out.
I've been sitting here being like, who are you talking about? But I totally remember this.
Well, we can figure out like, like you want to be careful. And I say this because it's like, this isn't always going to happen, right? But if you give the impression to Nina, let's say at her institution, that you're going to go there, okay? But then you also simultaneously tell us that you're going to come here, which is normal. We'll hear about it. And we talked about it, we traded notes about it. So
we did. That's
just
so
to say
true.
that can happen. And I'm not saying it hurt anybody's chances of like joining.
No, we had no say in anything.
We had no say, but like
interesting.
The word gets out, so be careful what you what you say at the different programs. I feel like people can sometimes be a little too forthcoming with their intentions. Yeah, exactly. It's too forthcoming. Don't be too open,
I was going to say it is a small world. Okay, this world of chemistry for one science or any, and applies probably to any other science. It's a small world where people are tightly networked and make chit chat. And I met someone at a visitation weekend in Irvine when I was a grad student already there, and later bumped into this person again when I was doing my postdoc. They were doing their PhD at a school that is in Cambridge, and we became friends after that. And that my only previous interaction with this person had been meeting them on a visitation weekend. So definitely, I love that. This, and then as you talk to that person, you then, the network gets filled in. And yeah, definitely. I might come to a student of mine and say, oh, this student that visited really seems like they want to come here, and it seems like I'm their top choice. That student might say, oh, well, I was just emailing with a friend of mine or texting or Instagram DMing with a friend of mine at another school, and they also visited there, and they said the same thing to that person's boss. So what you just said is absolutely true. And this kind of thing can move around. And I mean, you want to be excited. Okay, when you go to visit a school, definitely. Also, I will say that the first school I visited, I thought to myself, this place is awesome. I'm definitely coming here. I was just so dazzled. Okay. The next school I visited, I'm like, forget that first school. I'm definitely coming here. Yeah. I get to my third school. I'm like, oh man, neither one of those first schools has anything on this place. This place is awesome. I'm coming here. And then
be open-minded. Be open-minded.
And then I said the same thing at the fourth school, but in my defense, I ended up going to that fourth school. So
okay.
I would say at each visit, it was in fact my first choice in that moment. I was super excited about that place at that time.
Yeah.
That's really funny. Okay, so I love the social aspect of visitation week and stuff, but like just taking it back or like taking it home for visitation week, like what, I guess if you can walk away from visitation week, what are the biggest things that you want to accomplish in that kind of like visitation weekend? Like what are the questions that you need to answer? And like what are the other tasks that you need to kind of tick off outside of the social aspect of things? And in the more business aspect of things, I guess.
Yeah, you'll get a good impression of the program as a whole as to what the students like about it or dislike about it, no matter what. A lot of these things will get presented to you. A PI in a one-on-one meeting or a one-on-4 meeting is going to sound pretty compelling. They've given that little speech to try and recruit students 100 times. And if it doesn't sound good at that stage, then there's a deep problem. The most important information you get is from the grad students who are in the group. So those are the most important recruiters, in my opinion, for any PI. At poster sessions, go to the posters that are being presented by students who are in the group you want to join. Check out the science and ask the students some, probing questions. Do you like working for this person? You can ask that. And they might say, I don't like this. We're not friends. We don't hang out. I don't They're kind of surly to interact with, and we don't see them that often. But the science is really spectacular, and I really enjoy the group, and I enjoy the projects I'm working on, and the interactions I do have with the PI when they're important, like for writing a paper or planning a project, are extremely good. So you could get an impression of a PI like that, where it's the fact of the matter is what the student is there for is important and is going well, even if the PI doesn't seem like a fun person to be around. You can ask the students, what are the work expectations of this PI? So some PIs might have a very strict sort of, you have to be there on a weekend or at night. And the students might say they won't come out and say this, but they will be there, sort of make an excuse to come through lab to sort of take roll and see who's there and who isn't. And these things can either be green flags for you or red flags for you. If you want a really intense experience, we want to make sure that, the PI is holding you to a high standard and really making you, get the most out of your PhD. And this is what that means to you, is this, I would say, old school, always there, making sure students are getting FaceTime kind of situation. That's great. It could be a red flag for you. You might say, listen, I don't really need that right now. I don't particularly want someone telling me I have to work at a certain time. Everyone's different. I might make degree progress in a certain way and other people might make it in another. And what you're describing just sounds like something I don't particularly want to experience for 5 years. So this is where you sort of get the flavor of a PI. A PI can have a great stack of papers they published, really good funding, all the sort of metrics that make a person successful. And yet you might get the sense that you don't really want to work for this person. And I would also encourage you to get a diversity of voices. Talk to 3 or 4 different students. If you talk to that one student, who's in their 4th year, their paper should have come out a year earlier and it's just not quite done because the last few experiments are failing and the whole origin of the project is in question, and their partner just broke up with them, and it's, wintertime and the weather's terrible, and et cetera, et cetera. They're in a bad mood. They probably shouldn't even be at that poster session. That person might give you a skewed view of life in that group. And you might talk to 2 other people who are like, listen, don't listen to that person. They're having a bad week. Probably shouldn't be here. Here's our impression of it. So look for sort of a consistent theme for a group. And you'll get it if you talk to enough grad students. Also look for things that line up with what the PI is saying. If the PI describes life in the group one way and the students describe it night and day different, I would say that's kind of a red flag. I actually encourage students visiting. I'm like, talk to my grad students. Ask them any question you want about this group. I would rather have them know up front what they're getting into. If there's anything about me or the group that students don't particularly like, or they want to point out that other people might not like, do it. I would rather have that happen at the visitation stage or in the fall at the recruiting stage than 2 years into your PhD. So these are all things that just sort of factor in, and it's different for every person. I found it really interesting, Nina, in an earlier podcast when you were considering different groups and you described certain aspects of my group in the most charitable way, which I thought was awesome. You said, I wanted structure. I wanted some level of structure. And I'm like, that is a really great description, because, and I think of the group in those terms. I'm not trying to micromanage. I try to avoid that at all costs. But I find that it works best to have some level of structure, to have certain standards that have to be met. Not everyone gets to do everything their own way all the time, that makes it difficult for things to get done. So structure for you was a bonus. Structure for someone else might be exactly what they don't want in a PhD advisor. So you will get this sort of flavor by talking to the PI, but also, I would say more importantly, talking to the students who are in the group.
Yeah, I think that's... Go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I just think that's so critical, because a student that is going to join a group or a program, they need to understand what they need. And so they need to ask the questions that will indicate to them that this group will be right for them because of how they interface with science and people and things like that. So I just think it's super important that you ask the right questions, but that's all. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely didn't do that when I was or I hadn't really been thinking. I mean, that's why I had such a circuitous like journey
Yeah.
into a lab. But like, yeah, because I think I was just younger and I didn't really understand like what it was to work in an organization. And thankfully, like I molded myself, I think, into more structure, and I think that worked well for me in the long run. And it, I definitely also benefited from it. I wish I was more actively thinking about it when I was at visitation. So if you get the chance to really reflect on, what you're like as a person, please do that. I thought I did a lot of reflection, but it was evidently not enough. So
Dude, I was so judgy too because
yeah.
what I liked about Jared at visitation was his office was clean. I went to a professor's office at a different institution and their office was a complete mess. The science was cool, but I was like, I cannot work for somebody whose office looks like this. I know that I can't. So anyway.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I'm in the process of moving offices. My office is actually currently not that clean, but man, I'll make sure it's clean before visitation.
By March.
In my case, visiting schools, when I visited UC Irvine, where I attended graduate school, my advisor wasn't even there yet. And I wasn't considering his group at visitation. He was a new professor. And now we get new professors involved as early as possible, but often they haven't accepted offers until March, April, somewhere in there. So you might not have the opportunity to visit a professor who's just starting out when you go to campus visitation. Now, hopefully they will reach out to you. And, we often make sure that if it's an incoming organic professor, I'll pull them aside and say, listen, we can give you the emails of every student we admitted that, or every student that's coming in the fall. Or, if it's an earlier stage, let's say the visitation weekends have happened, but students haven't decided where they're going to go. You can get an email list of every student who's been admitted, and you can email them and say, hi, I'm Professor so-and-so. I just started at UC Davis, and here's a little research summary I can give you. And I'd be happy to meet with any of you if you want to send me a message back. So they can be involved in recruiting. They might not be part of the visitation weekend. The irony is that these are often PIs that are the most actively recruiting students. They're the ones who are going to maybe take the most students in the fall. And I will say they're some of the best professors to work for if you want that new lab experience, which can never be replicated. So I was one of the first students to join Keith Purple's group. There were 4 of us. And we all had a spectacular time. I mean, it doesn't mean there weren't challenges. Certainly you could bring Keith on this podcast and, he'll enumerate some challenges we had. And not everyone was happy every minute of the day, but we all had a very good experience. And I in particular had a spectacular experience. I loved my PhD. I had very tough times. There were times when it wasn't all roses. It wasn't all fun, but on balance, I had a spectacular PhD experience. And I could not have known that I was going to have that experience because I didn't even meet my PI at the visitation weekend. I decided to go to UC Irvine. I had a phone call with Keith Purple and he sounded interesting and I figured I'd meet with him in the fall. Same thing with Dave Van Franken, who was hired the same year. So I just want to add that because the visitation is very important, but it might not give you the whole picture. You might end up having these new professors. And if they reach out to you, definitely follow up with them and have a meeting because they might change your mind on where to go.
I think that's a great point. We're going to go back to this when we're thinking about choosing a PI, but I'm very curious to know what cinched the deal for you to join Keith's lab as opposed to the other people at Irvine.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll get back to that. What were you going to say, Nina?
I was just going to say that Joe also joined a new lab when he started grad school and he also really liked it. So I think it is a very exciting and unique experience, but that's all. What?
This is so chaotic for your dog right now.
I know. She's literally
she's like, I cannot be fucking bothered. I cannot. I have no cares.
I wish I could show you.
They're like, can we be done now so you can just pay attention to us and no one else on the planet?
Mom.
What questions do you think students should definitely ask a professor at visitation?
That's a great question. And the one that comes to mind is, ask what projects are being currently pursued. There's as both of you know, there can be a 1 to 2 year lag on what the group is doing and what publications are coming out. So there might be the last publication for a project where the grant ran out and that project is no longer being worked on. Even though there's a decade of nice papers on that, it looks like a super cool project. It might be totally over. And there might be new ones that are being fired up there are no publications. So definitely ask a PI, what types of projects do you see your students working on when they join in the fall? And they can say, you know what, I've taken a totally new research direction. I used to do lots of organic synthesis, but now we've gotten more into materials research. We don't have, here are the unpublished results, and now the whole group is actually making new materials or a biology project or something else. So that again factors in. You might have had a vision in your mind of this professor doing a certain kind of research based on the 15 years of papers you looked over. And it might be very different what's going on at that exact moment or when you join the group. Also, get a sense of what their work expectations are and what your goals are, and make sure those kind of align. And this is a sensitive topic because, and it's a sensitive topic for more now than ever, because of the whole unionization effort. There's this whole discussion of work, and the fact of the matter that everyone will have to keep in mind is that you are getting a stipend while you're there. That stipend can come from either being paid as a TA or as a GSR, grad student researcher, sometimes called an RA, research assistant. And that is a 50% appointment. The idea is the rest of your time is time for you to be a student pursuing a degree and making degree progress. And we could do a whole podcast on this, so I'll try to contain it in 60 seconds or less. So the question really comes down to when we talk about work, you got to be careful, because certainly when you're there in the evening running experiments, trying to get towards your PhD, you're not having fun at home with your friends. You're not on vacation. It feels a lot like work, feels a lot like a job you're showing up to, but you are working towards your degree. You're a student. You're making degree progress. You're no different than the law student that is in the library studying. So that is your time for you to spend as much as you feel like making degree progress. And there has, I'm assuming forever in the history of PhD research, been this desire from the PIs for the grad students to work as hard as possible and be there 80 hours a week. That used to be a cool thing. And, it used to be super cool if a grad student were there at midnight, and they happened to be the only one left surviving, running a column, getting that experiment, getting those results. And I would say for organic chemistry specifically, it's a science that moves fast. You can have an idea in the morning and you might have a result testing that idea by the end of that day. And your progress can sometimes track with your hours, or at least seem to, or at least it can be suggested that would be the case. And this used to be an incentive to work more and more hours running experiments. And so it has always resulted in a situation where students have had to ask themselves, like, how much time am I supposed to be spending in lab? Am I supposed to be here at midnight running an experiment? Like, is that what my PI secretly expects, even though they've never write it down, because then that might make it look like they're violating union rules and insisting on a 120-hour work week. So you don't want to get into that sort of morass, but you do just want to have a sense. Is this going to be a situation where I'm constantly being pressured to run more experiments when I'm not necessarily feeling like that's what I want to do at this exact moment? And again, this is, again, information I think you'll get best from the grad students you talk to. What is day-to-day life like in the group? And, the students can tell you a variety of different things. They can say, certain PIs are definitely constantly pressuring you to run more and more experiments. And they definitely expect you to be putting those extra hours as part of your degree progress. Others will say, PI is totally hands-off. You're on your own. If you want to leave at 4 in the afternoon and come in at 11:30 every morning, they're not going to notice or care, but you're not going to get a whole lot done. And you might think it's great that, you have this cushy experience, but you'll wake up in your third year and realize that students around you have already published papers and you don't have a lot done. And it will have been your own doing because the PI is not there breathing down your neck, telling you to run more experiments. So you want to you want to have a feeling for, do the expectations of the group align with what you want?
Yeah. Because there genuinely are people that want to be in lab until midnight. And there are some people that do not. And so you have to pick the lab that is going to be conducive to what your lifestyle is.
Yeah. And being that last grad student working there at midnight used to be cool. I would just say it's totally uncool now. It's unsafe. If you have a lab accident,
yes,
by yourself in a lab full of explosive, flammable things, the consequences could be dire. So I certainly appreciate it when students want to put in extra hours. If we're really trying to get results ready for a grant submission or a paper that's going out, there's certainly there's lots of work you can do in those extra hours, getting experimentals done, getting those last analytical experiments done. There are lots of things you can do. That it's changed also. You might be at home on your laptop, slogging through supporting information at midnight. And that's great if you want to put in that extra time because you're so enthusiastic, you're gung-ho to get the paper out the door. And yeah, you just want to make sure, you want to assess, you want to do, and you can't make sure of these things. That's the wrong term. You just want to have a feeling for, is this the right environment? In my lab personally, I've gotten very lax about this. I would say when I was earlier in my career, I was definitely more demanding. Later in my career, I realized that this roughly the same amount of work is going to emerge whether or not I'm, yelling at students to work more and run more experiments. And it all comes from students being self-motivated. If a student is motivated by if they believe in their project, if they believe in the experiments they're running, they will run the experiments. They'll be very excited about it. For certain people, I have a student now who you two overlapped with, I think, in the early days. This student does not work long days. But while they are there, they are a machine. They are getting lots and lots of things done. The flip side to a student who can really focus and be very efficient for the daylight hours and get everything they need to get done and more because they are really, really efficient. I was the opposite. I did not work terribly efficiently. I worked really hard, and I would just make up for my lack of efficiency by laying down more hours. And I was very excited to get those first early results. That was like an exciting time to be able to go into my advisor and say, check out this NMR. Like, you can tell this formed the product. This looks great. I would always get the question like, oh, okay, so what was the yield? I'm like, I don't know. So for me, I got lots and lots of exciting, awesome results, but I would often have to go back and do things a second and third time. And, getting table entries out of me was just terrible. There was a student next to me in our lab who worked, I don't know, half the hours I did. I'm exaggerating, but seemed to be putting in way fewer hours. But the percent yield, the number of useful things they got out of their hours was way higher. So
that's funny.
And if you know anything about Keith, he's a very table entry driven kind of chemist. He has the paper laid out and he knows like what data he wants. So
yeah, and that's why I've managed that. So having seen myself go through his group and how I work, we could do a whole podcast on authorship on papers. That's another issue. But I really recognize that last 20% of a paper is the least fun part. You're not getting new results. There's nothing exciting. You don't, and
you just have to finish.
But it has to get done or the paper doesn't go out the door. And so I put a lot of emphasis on that when it comes down to sort of the authorship order and who gets what credit. But that's a whole, like I said, that could be a whole podcast.
I mean, I want to bring it back to kind of thinking about, so aligning the advisor's expectations of you with kind of what you want out of it. I kind of think from a greater angle, it's also about being realistic with the expectations of the field, because I think people will come to find throughout their time in grad school that different fields have different expectations. Like, because different, realms of science require different things from you. If you're more theoretical, if you're somebody who's more working in the theoretical space, like, thinking is a really big part of what you do, right? Like, a lot of the work is sometimes internal. A lot of the work is doing, reading papers, exposing yourself to new ideas, etc. Like, that work might be different than if you're doing organic synthesis. It's product driven in the sense that you need to have some kind of output in order to analyze it and then validate whatever you're trying to kind of explore. So, like, that in itself is going to have a different rhythm of research. Like, Jared kind of touched upon this too. Like, chemistry specifically can be very fast paced, because, especially synthesis, because an idea you have that morning can manifest itself in actuality the same day if you really wanted it to. In some cases, if you have all the right ingredients. But there are other realms of research where it takes a lot of time. Like, you might not get the answer to an idea that you have, for like 2 months. A lot of biological research is longer on scale. So
and
as
that
a
can
result,
make it just it can make it more frustrating. You have an idea and you act on it, and you're not going to know the result for a month, and you can't push things. If an incubation takes 48 hours, or all the steps that are necessary to run that, you have to be very careful what experiments you choose to run. And so when I've worked on collaborative projects and I've talked to people who are more biological, we'll have an hours long talk about what the next experiments are. And it always confuses me. Like, we're spending so much time talking. Why aren't we actually going to do some of this stuff? But you need that extra time to plan out, because if you make some missteps and you waste a month, I mean, if either of you two mixed the wrong reagents and the experiment was a failure, you would do it again that day or the next day, and it'd be pretty easy to recover. The pace of publication also is one to consider. I think in certain biological fields, you might be expected to get one really good paper out of your PhD. Maybe you're second author on one paper and first author on another, and that's your whole PhD. I once got a little frustrated in our department that some of my colleagues would really brag about the number of papers a younger student in my theoretical colleagues group would have, and versus a synthesis student. And it used to frustrate me. And I finally ran an analysis just to prove my point. And the analysis was the following. I went to this person's PhD advisor, who's, we're not speaking code. This is Dean Tantolo's group we're talking about.
Uh-huh.
And Gene Tantolo and I have a wonderful relationship. If you look at the number of papers we published together, clearly we get along well. And I think theoreticians just don't like the suggestion that it's somehow easier. And I said, it's not easier, but it results in a more prolific publication rate. And to prove this point, I said, your PhD advisor was Ken Hauk. If you look at Ken Hauk's publication record from 1970 to 2010, which is kind of a golden era, I would say, for that PhD advisor, he published an average of 22 papers every year.
That's crazy.
For 40 years. Okay. Now, you look at my postdoc advisor, Dave Evans, who was a prolific, a very influential and important organic chemist during that same time period. Roughly, they were contemporaries. 1970 to 2010, Dave Evans published an average of 7 papers a year.
Wow.
And I would say their workforce during that time, Ken's
roughly
group
similar.
Similar, yeah. Dave Evans had a pretty big group. It wasn't like colossal. So, and that's more testament. That says nothing about Ken Hauk specifically or David Evans specifically. It basically just says that the different fields have different publication rates, that those are backed up by a different sort of pace of science that Anna was referring to. And that pace of science actually goes all the way back to sort of your day-to-day experience and the expectations that might be prevalent in that group.
I'm not sure how much that factored into, like, for instance, Nina's experience in kind of choosing a lab, because I know she had kind of debated going into chemical biology versus organic synthesis. Mm-hmm. But, like, this is something I imagine a student picking a PI, you should really think about the experiments you're running, because some people are motivated by having that fast, dopamine hit of like the result right away. And some people, might not necessarily benefit from that. Some people like kind of the planning aspect a lot more. And like, so I'm just getting at the sense that like, you guys should think about that these things not just as different research interests, but also think about how that translates to what you're going to be doing day-to-day life. Because I've met a lot of students going into grad school who are incredibly curious and so passionate about chemistry, and they love all aspects of chemistry. And when they're trying to decide what they're doing, though, at the end of the day, when PhD is about concentration, like that's something you have to be realistic with yourself about. Like you can be very, very interested in chemical biology, but still do an organic synthetic PhD, because that was the work that was going to motivate you and to get through, your day-to-day life. That doesn't mean that you don't care about physical chemistry or any other aspect of science. It just means that that's what you're going to be doing for the next 5 to 6 years. And ultimately, that doesn't necessarily also mean that you don't get to switch out of what you do. Like your PhD doesn't have to define your entire life's research trajectory. You can still nurture other interests. So yeah, that's kind of just what I wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, and if we return to this point about my advisor choice, I will touch on the fact that Keith's science initially was not something I found that interesting.
Oh, okay.
Really?
It was
I get it.
Okay. But it was Keith personally that I was motivated by. He gave me the sense that I was going to have a really great experience working with him, and I bought into it. And he delivered. I had a great experience with him. But I did not, initially, I had a hard time swallowing the fact. I'm like, wow, I came from Clayton Heathcock's group at Berkeley, where I did, synthetic methodology, in a group that did, synthesis methodology and natural product target synthesis. And that's what I wanted to do in Larry Overman's group at UC Irvine. And here's this guy telling me that I should get super interested in distilling out strange silicon compounds that smoke in air and moving them into a glove box, and looking at the, minutiae of their stereochemical, the outcomes of certain stereochemical transformations that were new to science. And it took me a while to come around to that being something I wanted to do, but it was the advisor himself. It was the person more than the science at that exact moment that motivated me.
Yeah.
That's actually really sweet. I didn't know that at the time. So I want to reiterate, like, I'm not dragging Keith's research. It's more just that, like, when I was visiting schools, there was somebody, I think somebody used this term, but like, there's going to be science that seems sexy. Like it's not a very sexy science. Okay. Sometimes like, so that didn't necessarily jump out at me. And when I was looking at advisors, there would be like research interests that I was like, oh, that's just cool. That's just, you don't have to sell that to me. That's just a cool thing, like just on its own. That's because branding wise, it was easy to sell, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to like working on it. Right. Like, so that's the only reason why I said that. It's like some people don't necessarily appreciate, like, there's going to be certain subjects that aren't necessarily immediately amazing to you in the beginning.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a worthwhile pursuit or that it's not going to be interesting over time.
Yeah. And when you see a PI give a talk at a conference, you're seeing the finished product, and it always looks great. And when you see the lead author or student giving a poster on that, they're showing you crossing the finishing line, the most fun part. There can be projects like that took a decade, and there are grad students who slogged away on the early stages of it, where it was going nowhere. And certainly they get credit for their contributions in the form of a paper, and that led to them getting a successful PhD and a great job. But their experience on that project was not terribly pleasant, let's just say. And that also factors in, Anna, to your point of, is this what you want to do on a day-to-day basis? Talking to a student who's in the early stage of a project that is difficult and looks like it may not even get done in the time that person's working on their PhD, that's tough. That's tough to, it's a different experience than, like I said, that finished product, the feeling you might get from seeing that finished product.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about pay in context of, I think it was how many hours you're working, but do you want to elaborate a little bit more on funding? Just like how generally does funding work in graduate school?
And related to kind of, it's about how concerned should a student be about funding when they're selecting a program or a school to go to? I think in that context, like, it's not just about money in general. It's like in the context of, like, we're doing an episode about people choosing schools, right? And ultimately maybe one day choosing an advisor. Should they be concerned about money? And how concerned should they be?
This is a great question, and there are many factors, and I'll try to cover them briefly, and I can elaborate on any one of them. When you're accepted to a school, you will get an offer letter that says you are guaranteed some level of financial support for the entirety of your PhD. And I want to take a minute and just reflect on the fact that science graduate school, PhD programs, this is the most elite, most privileged form of graduate school. You're not going to have to pay, because you also don't pay tuition. So you're not going to pay a dime in tuition, and you're going to get a paycheck the entire time you're there, guaranteed. And I sometimes have to make sure students understand this. If you're going to any other form of graduate school, you're paying tuition, and you're not getting paid the entire time you're there. So it doesn't feel privileged sometimes when you're slogging through a project and you've got a cranky PI who wants to get a paper out the door. You don't say to yourself, wow, I feel so privileged to be here. But it is financially an extremely good deal. At the end of those 5 years, 7 years, it's usually not 7, it's 5 usually, sometimes 6 in chemistry. You've also got an asset. You've got the highest research degree in the land that is extraordinarily valuable. So if you look at the value of the thing you're getting at the end and what you're getting along the way, it's really a great deal. I just have to give that plug. That stipend is going to be based on many factors. Certainly schools are trying to make it as high as possible to be competitive. So if a school has a very low stipend, the students might not go there over a school that's, let's say, competing for the same students. And a lot of things go into deciding how big that stipend is. And I don't want to go into all of that now because it's not really relevant. Students should keep in mind that number needs to be thought about in the context. So if you're being offered a certain, if you get into NYU graduate school and you have a certain stipend, you think to yourself exactly right off the bat, where am I going to live and how much it's going to cost? And how far is the stipend going to go there? You get that same stipend at Penn State. Okay. Penn State is a great school. It's got pretty cheap real estate. I've talked to students who were back in the day were able to buy a house, between them and their partner. So,
oh my God.
Yeah, it's crazy to even think about. So think about what that stipend means, where you're going to live. Housing is going to be your biggest cost. And that you might also get a moving bonus now. That is not uncommon. You might also get a fellowship. A fellowship can mean two different things. It can mean that you get a little extra money on your paycheck, but your experience is otherwise unchanged. A fellowship could also mean that when you join a group, that fellowship goes with you, and that helps support you while you're in that group. And so these are all the things. So when you're deciding where to go, the most important decision is this stipend going to support the life that I want to have in the place that I'm going to live? I will also tell students that the stipend is usually enough to live on and usually enough to cover all your expenses. And when I was in grad school, occasionally students did have to get a student loan while they were PhD chemistry students. And it wasn't that big a deal because normally you got employed at the end. And if you were $10,000 in debt at the end of your PhD, that's not a big deal. It's not like you've racked up $300,000 worth of med school debt that you need to have a mortgage on for 20 years. It was uncommon, but it's like any other school. If you find your finances are stretched thin, it's not that big a deal to get a student loan. It's uncommon, I would say now. Okay, so the support, though, while you're at the school, that stipend is money that has to either come from you working as a TA or from the PI committing graduate in student researcher, GSR or RA funds from a grant. And if you have a very well-funded PI with lots of big grants, They may have plenty of money for every student to be a GSR most of the time they're in graduate school. There's usually a required minimum number of TA quarters or semesters for each PhD student, meaning as a PhD student, you are learning to become an educator on some level, and you're going to participate in the education process by being a TA. When I was at UC Irvine, it was 4 quarters was the minimum of TA. And you can then also think in the opposite direction. If a group does not have a lot of research money, not a lot of grant money, and maybe a lot of graduate students, the students might have to work as TAs more. Now, being a TA is not terrible, but it does mean you don't have that time to run experiments that put you closer to getting your degree. If 2 different graduate students are in comparable programs, let's say at schools that are similarly ranked and with PIs who are similarly accomplished, the student who's in the PIs group where they're not having to TA beyond the minimum is going to get more research done. And that is probably going to be reflected in more papers and more job offers. So you can, and then schools have different rules. So sometimes in school, if you have a huge teaching program, you're teaching lots and lots of undergraduates, you need lots and lots of TAs. There might be lots of TA positions available so that, a grad student might be a TA quite a bit of the time if the PI's lab doesn't have enough grant money. There are other schools that are very strict about this. They tell PIs, like, listen, you can have up to 2 of your students working as TAs each quarter or semester, but beyond that, you have to be paying GSRs. And if you can't meet that, if you find that you don't have enough grant money, then you are not allowed to take more students. Because,
wow.
Yes. I know a friend of mine who I postdoced with is at a school. It's a private school. They get 4 quarters of TA. They get the minimum for each of their grad students. Beyond that, it's GSR the rest of the time. And if you fall below that threshold, if your students need to TA more than that because you run out of grant money, that's okay. They'll find TA positions for your students so that, your students still have a good experience in grad school. They don't have to quit grad school because you don't have enough grant money. You were then taken out of the recruiting pool in the fall. You were taken out of the visitation rotation in the spring. You are not allowed to recruit more students if you can't pay them. I think that's a very harsh standard that makes PIs stress out a lot. The single biggest stressor for a PI is grant money. It is this thing that, PIs talk about having grant mares. It is the recurring...
Mares!
I'm shook.
This is a recurring... Talk to just about any professor in science. They have recurring nightmares about running out of grant money. You'll wake up shaking in fear.
No.
And then
I'm sorry
you
you have to do that.
Can't sleep, and you get up and you start working on emails and reviewing grant drafts and sending messages to your students asking for research updates at 3 a.m. because you just that's how it is. It is that much of a stressor. So
okay.
it is that unpleasant.
This explains a lot about grant season now for on the graduate student side, because we'll get random emails, right? Like we're the ones we're getting the emails at 3 a.m. and we're like, what's going on? Like, why are we getting
I don't think I ever got a 3 a.m. email though. Did you?
I'm not saying
Okay.
that's what, I'm just saying I've heard other students have this experience where they're like, I just got an email at 3 a.m. and I'm not sure why. But it's probably because their advisor just woke up from a grant mare. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it is this tense situation. And, it's disappointing when we don't have enough grant money and my students have to TA more. I feel like that parent who can't feed their kids. I feel like I have failed. I am a failure at this stage. I've failed to provide resources for my children. And now I'm having to, send them to the coal mine. I'm having to pull them out of school to, help me harvest corn.
Oh my God.
Okay, yeah.
Oh my gosh, in the form of
It's so real.
Yeah, and the students don't like it. They would rather be running experiments and getting close to get their paper done. They don't want to be told they have to TA another quarter that they weren't expecting.
Especially during the summer.
Yeah, and summertime TAing is I had never even heard of it. I mean, I think one or two students when I was at Irvine had to TA during the summer, but it seemed weird. I was like, wait a minute. I thought everyone got to be a GSR in the summer. So a completely rational question at any school is, to what extent, if I'm in this group, to what extent can I expect to be a TA versus an RA or GSR, whatever they call it?
Yeah.
For the entirety of my PhD.
Very important question.
Yeah. And just for GSR means graduate student researcher. I don't know if we've defined that, but
yeah. And I mean, different programs call it different things. So I don't want to completely stick to this acronym, but yeah, I definitely think you should figure out how much time you're expected to be teaching and how much time you're expected to be doing work. I mean, you'll get your PhD eventually either way, but it's all about understanding what the experience is going to be like and having the right expectations of what that's going to be like. Yeah.
And the other thing, just to understand the pressure that's on PIs, I got a grant from the NIH in 2009. It was $250,000 a year for 5 years. I got another grant from the NIH in 2023. Do you want to take a guess how much it was?
$250,000, whatever you said.
Per year for 5 years. So between 2009 and 2023, the money I got from the NIH to do science did not change $1. What happened to grad student costs between 2009 and 2023? Like the cost of a single GSR quarter, astronomically.
Yeah. That's a lot. That is a lot of pressure.
That's nuts.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different angles to this support experience, but the one that matters to you as a grad student deciding where you're going to go and who you're going to work for is this GSR or RA versus TA. And the answer isn't necessarily a deal breaker. You might be so passionate about a particular PI that you're like, what, I don't care. This is the person I want to work for. They'll provide me with the support I need to really have a great PhD. And it's okay if I have to TA a few extra quarters along the way. It doesn't bother me at all. Yeah. And I wish there were more fellowship students could apply for that would sort of result in them having a little more agency for not having to work as a TA if they wanted to go that route. But, the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship basically says you don't have to TA for 2 years by paying you as GSR. It's just incredibly competitive. They don't, the number of those they give out versus the number of grad students attending grad school each fall is, it's pretty small. It's recognized as a very small number of applicants.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last kind of factor that we kind of wanted to touch upon in terms of selecting a program or selecting grad school is kind of location and how that feeds into things. I know you have strong feelings about location, and how strong of a factor it is. So do you want to touch upon that again?
Yeah, I like to say at the application stage, location sort of matters. Try to be as flexible as possible, and definitely don't even apply to a school where you're pretty sure you're going to be miserable. So if you really don't like cold weather, don't apply to the University of Wisconsin. Even though that is an exceptionally good program and I recommend it, I endorse it every year as a place to apply to school. So it gets a lot more real though once you've been admitted to schools. So once you've admitted to 3 schools, it's not hypothetical. It's a real question. Do I want to live here? And I think, again, going back to the visitation, you get a sense of that. The visitations are going to be in February. So if cold weather's a problem of yours, you're going to experience roughly how cold it gets there when you're visiting. You'll also just get that sort of vibe. When you visit UC Davis is in a small town, which there aren't that many small towns left in California. There are actually lots and lots of small towns in California, but I would say many small towns have gotten sort of subsumed by bigger urban areas. And that's not the case for Davis. We're sort of cut off from, we're not a suburb of Sacramento. We're physically separated from Sacramento, and it's got this small town feeling. For some people, that's really appealing. They're like, I love it. This is great. And others are like, this seems terrible. I really don't want to live here for 5 years. So I would say the location, try to be as flexible as possible and think about it carefully when you visit. Your visit is probably going to change your opinion on a place one way or the other. You're either going to visit and say, wow, I love this vibe. This seems great. Or, you know what? I don't really like I don't want to go here. Even, all things being equal between this school and another school that has a similar number of people I might want to work for, the other school, I'm just going to, make my decision based on location.
So we had another question in context of location. And I feel like you had some experience with this when it came to your entire graduate to postdoc transition. What do you think about people in relationships going to grad school?
The two-body problem.
This is always a challenge, and everyone's relationship's different, and everyone's going to be able to make the decision for themselves. I think long distance relationships are just inherently challenging, and sometimes they survive the distance, sometimes they don't. And I think sometimes the distance maybe just brings into sharp relief things that were already happening that maybe meant the relationship was not going to last anyway, but you were able to ignore it until you lived apart, and then suddenly you had to face these things. So I was in a relationship when I left for graduate school, and the distance wasn't super great. It was, Bay Area versus Southern California. And I won't say that relationship ended because of the distance. I will say that it ended because it like I said, things got brought into sharp relief. There were things I couldn't ignore anymore. And that was a complicated and difficult situation for me, going through a breakup in my first year. But it had to happen. I'm ultimately grateful it happened. And, each of us is better off not in that relationship. That relationship was not one that was going to continue one way or another.
Did it impact your decision-making process for grad school at all to minimize the distance, or?
It didn't. I'm positive this person's not listening to this podcast, so I can speak pretty freely on it. And I think what I realized is that when I had the prospect of being in graduate school, I had stayed back for a year. So the relationship decision I made was to not go to graduate school the year I was admitted, but to defer for a year.
Oh, wow.
And this was a difficult one because my first choice of PI called me in lab, and this was Larry Overman, and said, Jared, I really want to try and get you to come to Irvine this fall. And he said, I've got spots in my group, and I think you'd be a great addition to the group. I really want you to come here this fall. And it was devastating and difficult to say, listen, I can't do that right now. I'm in a relationship, and my girlfriend's still in college. She's got one more year of college, and then we're going to make a decision from there. And I said, I'm going to defer for a year. And he was very cool about it. And he said, he actually, the little piece of advice he gave me, said, well, life's never easy. I was like, that's kind of true.
Oh my God.
You're gonna have to make hard decisions as an adult pretty often. So I stayed back for a year, and I worked at a company, but I committed to going to UC Irvine. And I think what I noticed that was my first red flag for this relationship is that as I was preparing to leave to go to grad school, I was excited. I was like, this is awesome. When I finally got down into Irvine and moved into my apartment and everything else, I was just like, I felt kind of relieved and excited to be there. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I think ultimately what I was really thinking was, I'm not sure I want to be in this relationship. And, at first it was easy to just sort of get along with the fact that it was long distance, but ultimately, I don't want to drone on and on. Ultimately, that relationship ended. So I think carefully about a long distance relationship. I don't want to get too much into relationship advice, but grad school certainly is an occasion where this might come up. And be prepared for it not to be easy, and be prepared for it to bring up things that you hadn't pondered previously. This, like I said, the distance can bring things into sharp relief. What it might bring into sharp relief is that relationship's more important to you than the graduate school you chose to go to. And you're like, you know what? I'm out. I need to be with that person.
That's so true.
We need to make a decision to go somewhere together. And this was a bad idea. But I was excited about grad school, and I thought I could handle it, and I can't. And that relationship's very important to me. And I'm going to make a decision based on that, not based on graduate school. And give yourself a little space to do that if that's where your relationship is. Yeah. So you you may end up making a decision in favor of your relationship that is for a school that maybe is slightly lower ranked or has PIs you're less excited about. But that might end up being the very best decision for you personally. Also, you don't know if you've made the right decision about a PI.
Yeah.
Until about 2 years into your PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 years in, if you're thinking, man, I'm still very excited about this group. I've got a great project. The PI is interacting with me in exactly the way they described in the visitation weekend. I'm liking my personal life and my spare time. I can do things in my spare time in this location that I like to do. I made the right decision. 2 years in, you might also be saying, wow, I can't stand living here, et cetera, et cetera. Everything I just said in reverse or in opposite form.
That's so true, though. You really don't know. You don't know if you made the right choice until you join a lab, until you've spent time in that lab, until you're doing the day-to-day, interacting with the PI in a different way than you used to. So that's why it's always possible to potentially switch labs. So that kind of choice is not as strongly weighted as it is still strongly weighted. You should try and make the choice correctly the first time, but there are avenues for people like me that made made the wrong choice. Yeah.
You know what I was going to say though? It's weird. This is a room full or a virtual room full of failed long distance relationships.
Oh,
because I had almost identical situation, Jared. I was in a relationship going into grad school. We broke up the second quarter, I want to say, of grad school.
You broke that news to him the first
at the first year party.
At the first year party, yeah.
But you just, I remember because I had gotten into a school closer to where he had gotten into school, and I just had a pit in my stomach thinking about going there because I really wanted to go to UC Davis, and I just was like, I am not going to sacrifice something that I want, because I wanted to go to UC Davis for undergrad actually, and I was waitlisted, so I ended up going to, doesn't matter, but long story short, I was like, I'm not going to give up. Oh my gosh. Hi, Dwayne. I'm not going to give up on my lifelong dream of going to UC Davis for some dude. And then we broke up. So, anyway.
Yeah. I think also...
In my case, it was...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yes. No, Jared, finish your thought. You've been holding on to it.
Having a long-distance relationship at the outset of grad school is difficult because it's a transitional period, you're still growing, and it's a long time. It's 5 years, probably. Assuming your partner also can't do something in those 5 years to live in the same town as you. Assuming you might be making a decision to be apart for 1 year, right? Maybe you're going to grad school that year, and then this person's going to come to that same grad school the next year, or one that's in the same town, or in the an hour away instead of 5 hours away. But if you're making a decision to be apart for the entirety of PhD, that's difficult. That's a long time. And it's a transitional period where you're growing and experiencing lots of new things and changing. Making a decision to be long distance at the postdoc stage is different. That is a shorter time period. And you might actually have made some concrete plans for your long-term future at that stage. It's like, listen, we're going to be apart for this postdoctoral period of 2 years or 3 years. And at the end of that, we have a plan as to how we're going to be together. And we've been in a relationship for however long. So I think deciding on a long distance relationship at grad school is maybe more difficult than other long distance situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also just know that, like, for my experience on my side of things, I was in a long-term relationship with someone, which influenced the schools that I applied to, because when we were together, I was applying for grad school, and I made a conscious effort to apply to a lot of California schools because this person was going to be doing grad school in California. And then by the time I had made my decision to come to Davis shortly after, in that summer, we had broken up. So that didn't influence, I don't think it ultimately influenced my decision-making process. It influenced my application process more than anything. I selected schools that were going to be there. I was going to come to Davis no matter what. But so just to go, it just goes to show that things change very rapidly, and you got to be open to that, especially when you're at that time period of your life.
Yeah,
you're probably in your early 20s, mid 20s, and you get it. Things just change. Okay, I think that wraps up all the topics we wrote down. Are there any last minute things that we want to kind of do before we end officially the podcast portion of this.
I think another good time to think about a group that hasn't come up yet is attending group meetings. Sometimes, even at the pre-admission stage, you might have the opportunity to attend someone's group meeting. If the grad school is not too far from you, you might visit and attend a group meeting. When students email me and ask, like, "Hey, I'm going to be in Davis this, for this time period," or I want to come over and I'm working in the Bay Area and I want to come to your group meeting. My answer is always yes, absolutely. Come check out group meeting. What I'll add to that is that in the fall, the minute you get to the school you're going to, start going to PI's group meetings. And I think, we might have a whole different podcast on choosing a PI, and you two have touched on this topic, but that also is a time to sort of see how the group interacts, see how the PI interacts with the group. Is it a very top-down situation in group meeting, where the PI is running things and people sit quietly and don't ask questions? Or is it an engaged, collaborative, everyone's asking questions, the PI is getting, encouraging people to ask questions, etc. So I'll throw group meeting in there as another avenue for getting to know PIs. It's not usually part of visitation weekend. It's more of something that can happen once you arrive in the fall. It can sometimes happen over the summer before you go to that school that you've decided on. And it can even happen pre-decision if the geography is right.
Honestly, I'm glad that you mentioned that because I had no idea about these things when I was in Davis in July before I started grad school. So I was just like hanging out in Davis, playing Pokemon Go in 2016, but not doing anything related to the grad school at all. And I don't know if I would have, because my intention was to take the summer off, but I didn't even think of it as a possibility.
It's pretty low pressure, just going to a meeting for a couple of hours and seeing what's going on,
I like to think of it as like being visible, reminding people that you exist because, otherwise it's very easy to get lost, right? Like depending on how big your cohort is, people are busy and stuff like that. And I feel like when I give advice to people about like what they can do to, either during their rotations or joining a lab, I'm always like, group meeting is like a low effort, low key way of just showing up and that's your way of telling people you're still interested. So they'll always they'll know. Like I remember you and I will make this comment sometimes, like, well, that person stopped coming to group meetings. I don't think that person's really interested in us anymore. Or this person really still comes to group meetings. I think this person still thinks that they want to be here. That's the kind of signal that you send.
It's true. Yeah, definitely. Do you have any final thoughts, Jared?
My final thought is visiting schools is sometimes the most important factor. And in the end, you're going to make a decision based on your feelings, your emotions, what the impression you have on a place. There's no metric you could put in a spreadsheet that's really going to make this decision easy. If you're really agonizing between two places, it's going to come down to your feeling of one place versus the other, not really a metric you can enumerate. And I will reiterate that your choice of PI, the choice of group, that is the most important decision you're going to make as a graduate student. You could go to a school that has a really great name in the rankings and has a wonderful program, a wonderful history of their students getting great jobs in a wonderful location with a wonderful new building. And if the PI you work for just you don't work well with that person, you don't have a good working relationship with that person. You don't have to like them. I'm saying a good working relationship. That's the most important thing. Then you're not going to have a good experience in spite of the fact that there were all these other things in favor of that particular school. So you want to go somewhere where you're going to establish a really great working relationship with a PI. And that's the most important decision you're going to make in grad school. And it starts with what school you choose to go to. But then go with what you're feeling is the right decision. Mindful of the fact that you're not going to know if it was the right decision until a couple of years into it, as we discussed earlier. There are things out of your control. So that's basically
awesome.
It. I wish I had something a little more concrete and not as emotion driven, but that's the reality of it.
No, I think that's so real though. There's so much of it that is emotion driven. Thank you, Jared, for coming again. And maybe we can schedule another one to talk about, what was it? How to pick a PI.
Meaning once you're there,
Once you're there.
Picking among the PIs of
Exactly.
the program you join. Well, I will say thank you for having me. And also thanks for doing this podcast. You're providing a really great insight into grad school as a whole. And I hope lots of people listen to not only this episode, but all the episodes. I'm certainly recommending them to everyone I talk to.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for promoting us.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Cool.
Yeah.
So what did you think?
I think that we've covered, really a lot of important stuff. The running theme of the episode to me was you gotta understand, you have to understand yourself to know what the right expectations are. And then you need to have realistic expectations of both yourself and who you're working for, or like who you like, or the program that you're going into. Like, I don't know, being realistic is important. It's hard to.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And that's what I was talking about when we filmed the episode about choosing a lab, like our rendition of that.
Yeah.
Like you have to know yourself well enough to know what you need. If you don't know what you need, then you're never gonna, like, you'll be lucky if you find a perfect fit of a lab for you.
Yeah. And you don't want to be lucky going into grad school. You don't want to rely on luck. Luck is always a part of it, but I don't know. You need something more substantial than just luck to get you into the right place for you.
Yeah. Well, and I think like just don't be Delulu because because
it's not the Salulu in this case.
It's not the Salulu. Well, I really went against my better judgment. I have gone against my better judgment in certain decisions I've made, thinking like, oh, I don't need structure. And then I realized, no, wait, yes, no. I create structure for myself a lot at this point in my life, but it's also, sometimes there's also places that actually refuse structure or don't want structure. They don't want you to be structured. So you don't want to join a place that doesn't want to be structured if you need to be structured. You know what I mean? Like,
labs are like reflections of the people that lead them, right? Like Jared, for instance, is he's more organized. So his lab is going to be more organized. And I think that's like a really important point that you pointed out, where you were looking at people's like state of their offices to see kind of what kind of person they are. And I think that's like the investigative work you need to do, is like understand what this PI is like, because this PI is going to make the lab kind of in his image. And if you might encounter a PI who's kind of more like loose and more like chaotic and spontaneous, and that means that the lab environment is going to be a reflection of that. I didn't know that these were the things I should be thinking about for sure when I was coming into things. I think I was very like fixated on the research subject. I think like the research focus was kind of the biggest deal for me, and I wasn't so much thinking about the other components. I was like, I can tolerate, bad people for 5 years if the research is interesting enough.
That's crazy.
I'm kind of glad that I didn't do that,
Glad you didn't do what?
I'm glad that I didn't join a lab that I was only in it for the research and I didn't like anything else. I think that would have made it really hard for me. Because even when the research was getting really like, like you're just like not feeling the research, at least I kind of liked everybody in lab, that's
kind of liked. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, no, we had a good...
Or at least, like, Jared put you on a path where it was, like, a good enough structure that you knew, like, you're going to get the PhD within a reasonable amount of time, and you're probably going to get a job in a reasonable amount of time. Like, it gave me the confidence to know that if I followed the steps, that I would reach the end.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, so how was visitation for you? By the way, that's where we met, by the way. We met at Visitation, UC Davis, 2016.
Visitation was fun. I mean, it was my first time being on my own, like really out of New York. I didn't have a lot of experiences like that at 22 because I stayed at home for undergrad. And so that was really nice. I remember they put us in like this hotel downtown. And it's not the same hotel. They used the motel, I'm pretty sure. They didn't use like the nice hotel. They used the motel. You know the one that they found the dead body in? That's where I stayed. Yeah.
What?
Yeah, that's where they put me.
Why? That's not where we were.
I don't know.
Were there two different hotels?
Yeah. I don't know. Like I was in the motel. I remember I was in that. I was in that
You were at
hotel
the
where
Best
they
Western?
found that. Yeah,
I don't
that's
know
where
if I
they put
believe
me.
you.
No, I swear to God, we would have to confirm with Angel because he was in my visitation weekend. But that's where they put me.
I was in your visitation weekend.
I forgot.
That's what I just said 2 minutes ago. That's where we met.
Well, because like I only remember I remember our interaction outside of Memorial Union where you were
Yes.
where we were talking to
Joya.
we were talking to Joya. And that's when she was like, you need to open a new credit card when you come in here. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's crazy.
You need to what?
I did not.
Yeah.
I was like not prepared to do that. And then she told me to do that. And I was like, you know what? Joya gave really good advice. So shout out to Joya.
Well, she's a professor now. So
yeah,
she's
shout out
killing
to
it.
Joya.
Yeah.
Shout out to Joya.
Yeah.
So that was like advice that I held on to. I, went out after like at the nighttime. Well, yeah, we didn't talk about the dinner. Because most programs will do a dinner.
The dinner. We did a dinner the night before. Yeah. Yeah. At the dinner, I sat next to Professor Annalisa Franz, who is actually Jared's wife. So.
Right. Well,
but she did not know at the time.
For the viewers, like what happened was there's usually this dinner that they invite all of the graduate the prospective visiting students to, and then they'll have like some professors also attend, and then they mix you up so that there's some professors and some students. They don't really try to like at this stage make you sit with people that you're interested in. So I don't actually remember which professor I was sitting next to. I think it was Labria. I'm pretty sure I was sat next to Labria.
Really?
Yeah,
that's
analytical and not my concentration, right? But I think that the purpose of that dinner was just to kind of mingle a little bit, just to get to know the department a little bit more. And then the next day after that dinner, there were the not interviews, but you basically got scheduled
meetings.
To go meet with professors in like small groups of 3 or 4. And then you might not get every professor on your like that you requested, but you got most of them. So, or at least I got some of them. And after that, then they planned some kind of social, like you went out to drinks basically. There's usually a bar. And I will say this, Jared made a good point. Like you want to talk to the graduate students, and here's why talking to graduate students is like your best resource. During the day, the professors give you their spiels. They prepared it. They like know what they're trying to tell you. And then at the nighttime, the graduate students they're the ones getting a little messy. For sure. Do not be messy. If you're visiting, stay chill, stay leveled. Let the graduate students get a little like rowdy, and then that's when you go ask them the like really hard hitting questions. And that's when I got like a lot of like information that I wasn't expecting. And I think it's important to highlight this because graduate students are usually pretty honest. Like I don't think they'll lie to you.
Especially not at visit. Well, maybe they'll want you to come in theory. Like you're still selling the school. You're not going to be super negative. You may be negative about your boss, but not about the school.
Right. But what I mean to say is that there are things that maybe they don't say, but they won't outright tell you a lie, if that makes sense.
For sure. Yeah.
Like no one's doing that.
No one's going to lie to you like that. But
they might choose not to tell you certain things, but for the most part, they're going to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny. I don't know if we should include this, but there was one visitation where there were trays of shots being passed around.
I know who the professor was.
But like it certainly has gotten like significantly less messy.
And
that was like 2017.
It's kind of funny.
It was fun
to be messy. Like I can't think of a single instance in which somebody didn't get into a lab that they wanted to get into because of their behavior on visitation weekend. I will say that.
Agreed.
Because like by the time visitation weekend is in like March, February, so by the time you join the program, I know during the podcast I said people remember things, but you have another opportunity to like showcase who you are once you're actually in the program.
And also, even though like we have witnessed things, I would never hold it against
Yeah,
any
no,
of
me
those
neither.
people,
Me
even
neither.
though I remember. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah.
that
The
was
thing is,
just
like,
like an
Nina will
oopsie.
never forget. Nina will never forget, but she will
My memory
forgive.
is too good.
But she will forgive.
I will. I do forgive.
Yeah, yeah. I
God,
forget
yeah.
and forgive. So
Yeah. You forgive as a result of forgive.
yeah, literally, I forgot it, and therefore it's no longer an
Forgiven.
issue.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this was a fun episode.
I think so too.
See you next time. I'm like
On
literally
Basically Doctors.
on Basically Doctors.
Oh my God.
Can we just end with a zoom in on Dwayne? Like, is that Dwayne or Johnson? Let's just end with, let's fade our voices out and just end in, like, just